Critics complain that for all the heat and light the truthers generate, there aren't many alternative scenarios to challenge the official story.
But they don't feel that that's their job. They feel their job is to show everybody that the official theory of 9/11 is wrong, and then when everybody's convinced, then the population will rise up and demand a new investigation with government resources, and that investigation will tell us what actually happened.
But Professor Key Dudney at Western has connected the dots, putting together what he presents as a workable timeline to explain what really happened on 9/11.
Let me just paraphrase the feasibility scenario that you put out there. Yeah. That those 4 jetliners took off that morning, that they were then ordered down into a military facility,
possibly.
That 2 other jetliners painted to look like United or American Airlines went back out, reassumed the American 11 and United 175 flight paths, and hit the Twin Towers.
Basically, yeah. And those are remote control.
The passengers and crew were put on United Airlines Flight 93, which then intentionally crashed into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all the witnesses. And a cruise missile of some sort, or a fighter aircraft, hit the Pentagon.
And they said,
afterwards, Dudney suggests, the 3 remaining original airliners were flown into the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I think that much as you have sketched that is a standard, take on what may have happened. Feasible? Sure, why not? Tell me an objection.
Crazy, tell me an objection.
When we return, what the truth movement calls the Achilles heel of the official story, World Trade Center Building 7.
You didn't have any airplanes. You didn't have any that impact to destabilize the building.
And why all of this matters.
It's larger than any danger right now of other terrorists doing something to my family, is this pervasiveness of this misinformation that has now traveled to parts of the world that aren't crazy about us to begin with.
By mid-morning on September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers had been reduced to tragic piles of steel and dust. Across the plaza, World Trade Center Building Number 7 was still standing, 47 stories tall. But not for long. That afternoon, at 20 minutes past 5 o'clock, Building 7 also disintegrated before our eyes, though it had not been ravaged by a passenger jet.
For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Ever since, it's been the mantra of the 9/11 truth movement.
I'm not kidding you. Building 7 is the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history.
Richard Gage, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, says that couldn't happen simply because of the fires that raged for several hours in Building 7, caused by falling debris from the Twin Towers.
A 47-story skyscraper. It's converted all of its gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy. Therefore, it can't crush the 40,000 tons of structural steel that's holding it up and fall at free fall speed, meaning those columns had to have been removed and could only have been removed explosively.
As soon as the first building collapsed, I knew right away that that had nothing to do. There was nothing about that struck me as explosives could be involved.
Brent Blanchard is an internationally recognized demolitions expert, hired to work at Ground Zero in the aftermath of 9/11.
A lot of folks just generally saw a building falling straight down. Right from the beginning, it didn't look like that to me, and it didn't look like that to my people, because as the structure falls, giant sections are legging out off to the sides. It did not fall into its footprint. It did not fall at free fall speed. It did what something does when it's weakened to that level. This is Building 6. This is the Customs House. Building 7 would have sat right over here, and the North Tower would have been sitting right over here.
Blanchard says it's obvious to him the collapses began on the floors where the planes struck the towers. He argues that planting explosives there beforehand would have been useless. Afterwards, impossible.
If they had been placed there beforehand, they would have been blown out or affected by the plane's impact. And I don't see how they could have been placed there after, with the tremendous heat and the fires.
But what about the so-called squibs of smoke and debris that truthers insist are proof of explosives?
None of those things happened before that collapse. That collapse begins, then you start seeing other things happen, whether it's air pushing out, whether it's other types of things that are happening as the building's falling. I don't know. I wasn't in the structure at the time. It would be conjecture. There's no evidence pointing to anything else. That's the visual evidence, and that's all the evidence we have to go on.
Flowing like lava, the first responders said.
Richard Gage maintains there is evidence of something else, discovered in the pulverized concrete of the destroyed Twin Towers. Microscopic globules of molten iron. Why would that be important?
These tiny microspheres have in them the chemical evidence of thermite, iron oxide, aluminum, manganese, many of them sulfur. So this is clear evidence, because this is an incendiary that becomes explosive.
The thermite Richard Gage refers to is a combination of aluminum powder and metal oxide that can generate vast amounts of heat when ignited. Gage insists the presence of thermite at the World Trade Center site can mean only one thing, that it was used to sever the columns in Towers 1, 2, and 7 as part of a controlled demolition. Yet the federal government agency responsible for analyzing the collapse of those buildings admits it never even tested for thermite.
Now, according to Gage, in the Trade Center dust, they've also found residue of nanothermite, a kind of super thermite. Perfect, he says, for covert implosions.
Well, if you were trying to perform a deceptive controlled demolition, you wouldn't use traditional high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which have loud bangs and bright flashes. Super thermite does not have the loud bang and the bright flashes that these normal explosives do for explosive controlled demolition.
Brent Blanchard admits he's not a thermite expert, but one thing he knows well is that preparing a skyscraper for implosion takes much time and many people to expose the supporting beams, weaken them floor by floor, then place the explosives. It's estimated as much as 100 tons of thermite would be necessary.
My issue with it is still, how do you get to the exposed columns? How do you apply enough thermite to enough columns to have it work? How are you still cutting these beams? How are you still cutting hundreds of them in order, which is what was required to make the building collapse?
But to Blanchard, the best argument may be these seismographs for New York City on 9/11.
Taken the morning of September 11th. This is a waveform showing ground vibration as it was recorded at the Ground Zero site on September 11th. This particular piece is the North Tower collapsing. And what you're looking at is actual ground vibration of the collapse transferring through the beams into the ground and being recorded. It is actually showing you that gradation.
And if this had been a controlled demolition, how would it be different?
If there had been any catalyst, you'd see another spike out here. There'd be a spike right in here, and that spike would be the actual catalyst defeating the beams.
The explosion.
Some type of explosion, right.
But for the Twin Towers and Building Number 7, he says, seismographs show nothing of the kind.
Very much the same thing.
Many of these issues could have been addressed, even resolved, by the 9/11 Commission, the independent body tasked with providing the fullest possible accounting of the events surrounding 9/11. But in its final report, the Commission effectively dismisses the subject of explosives in the Twin Towers, leaving it for other federal agencies to examine. As for World Trade Center Building Number 7, it simply ignores that altogether. After a 3-year investigation, the report by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, found no evidence of explosives at the Twin Towers and made no mention of thermite. As for Building Number 7, NIST says uncontrolled fires on multiple floors caused the failure of a critical support column, then a progressive collapse. Your dismissal of that is that it couldn't have happened in the uniform way that would be necessary for the building to fall the way it did.
Correct. The rest of the columns could not have been destroyed sequentially so fast to bring this building straight down into its own footprint. Like a house of cards, all the structural members, or most of them, had to have been cut in order for a 47-story building to collapse into a pile 4-5 stories high.
It's at the heart of this fundamental disagreement about the most crucial day in modern American history.
Well, 3.5 years ago, virtually everyone I talked to thought I was nuts. Well, I would say 80 to 90%. Now it's only like 30 to 40%.
And we have given hundreds and hundreds of architects the truth.
Since 2006, through speeches and the internet, Richard Gage has recruited about 900 architects and engineers to his cause. But some of the most troublesome questions that remain have little to do with things like structural design or physics.
If you've wired these buildings for controlled demolition, why would you need airplanes? If you got the bombs, why couldn't you have just blamed that on the Iraqis and Al-Qaeda?
Well, we have the evidence for explosive controlled demolition. You're asking me to speculate. Every time the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth speculate and veer away from the evidence, it's the speculation that's used to try an attempt to invalidate the evidence. So that's why we do not speculate as to these kinds of questions.